Hello, my name is Elizabeth Comer. I'm the Secretary of the Catoctin Furnace Historical Society and by profession an archaeologist. And I'd like to welcome you today to our new AfricanAmerican Cemetery Interpretive Trail at the historic village of Catoctin Furnace. This trail begins at the Isabella Stack and the casting shed and takes you through the woods, ending up at the closest point to the African-American Cemetery. And the trail through the waysides tells the story of the African-American enslaved and freed workers who made Catoctin Furnace products from 1776 until the mid-19th century. It talks about their lives and their work and their death here at Catoctin. It's an incredibly important story and one that has heretofore not been told. And so we are incredibly pleased to be able to share this story with you. Please come to Catoctin Furnace and walk the trail. Bring your mask so that if you meet people on the trail, you can be safe and socially distanced. But we look forward to welcoming you to Catoctin Furnace so that you too can share and learn about this story of the African Americans who helped build the wealth and prosperity of the United States today. This is stop number 2 on the Catoctin Furnace African American Cemetery Interpretive Trail, and this is a place where we can talk about the dirty and dangerous nature of the work. The African American enslaved and freed workers here were exposed to hazardous fumes and backbreaking labor as they worked and toiled in the furnace. The women, children, and infants were also exposed to these hazardous materials and hazardous conditions. You will learn about this and learn about the jobs that were part of the furnace workers' lives. At this wayside at Catoctin Furnace, we call it the watchful eye because the location of the slave quarters across Catoctin Furnace Road was in plain view of the ironmaster's mansion on top of the hill. This slave quarters was standing until the early 20th century when it was torn down. Before it was torn down, it was used first as a mule barn and then as a blacksmith shop. The remains of it archaeologically are across the road. We also know that we had at least 16 freedom seekers from Catoctin Furnace, men, women, and children who sought their freedom by crossing over into Pennsylvania, leaving behind the institution, the cruel institution of slavery. So this is what you will learn about at panel number 3 at Catoctin Furnace, called the Watchful Eye. The workforce at Catoctin was diverse and skilled, and we have evidence that some of these skills may have been brought with African Americans from Africa, where ironmaking is an ancient and revered profession. Some of the workers at Catoctin we know by name, only first name, but for instance, Collier Sam and Wagoneers Henry and Harvey. They were mentioned specifically by the furnace owners as these with their job titles. But for the most part, we do not know the names of individual workers. What we do know is that it was a diverse workforce and a highly skilled workforce. And here at the African American Cemetery Interpretive Trail, stop number 4, you will learn about these jobs and the skills that these people had. As you walk along the trail, you will see discarded to the left and the right bricks and slag. And these are byproducts of the furnace operation. When the furnace had to be relined every few years, the bricks were simply discarded. And slag is made at every time iron is made, and it was also discarded. At Catoctin Furnace, many things were also reused. Blacksmiths recycled iron so that they could make new nails or new horseshoes or other implements. And even after the furnace shut down in the early 20th century, the stones of the original casting shed were taken down and across the street and made into arches, Gothic arches, at Harriet Chapel. So at Catoctin, the resources were used, reused, and recycled. We also know a great deal now, using some modern technology, about the use of the mountains and the amount of wood and charcoal that was made. We have found 1,303 charcoal hearths in what we call the Greater Furnace Lands, which is an 11,441 acre tract that was part of the Catoctin Furnace. So on the trail, please don't pick up the brick or the slag. Leave them where they are for the next visitors to enjoy. At the first overlook on the Catoctin Furnace African-American Cemetery Interpretive Trail, you'll be able to look into the village and learn about the store, the church, the worker housing, and the various parts of the village and who built them. While we've been learning a lot about the African-American enslaved and freed workers of the village, after they began to disappear from the village in the mid-19th century, they were replaced by European immigrants who came to work in the iron industry, many of whose descendants still live in the village today. That's what you'll learn about when you stop here at the overlook and look into Catoctin Furnace Village. Stop number 7 on the Catoctin Furnace African-American Cemetery Interpretive Trail talks about the secondary industries that grew up around the primary iron-making industry at Catoctin. There was a grist mill where wheat was ground into flour. There was a sawmill for making lumber to build houses. There was even a paint mill that took advantage of the clay colors that surrounded the ore to make paint. There were also cottage industries we found evidence of archaeologically. We know that they were repairing shoes here at Catoctin. There were seamstresses making clothing. There was even a very unusual making of lamp work in glass. In other words, it was this very decorative glass bead and swirly stick kind. We don't really know what it was, but it's a very interesting cottage industry. So those industries supplemented the salary or the work that the people here at Catoctin had from the iron-making industry. The layers of history are deep and inclusive at Catoctin Furnace, beginning with the Native Americans who lived here before the first European Americans and enslaved Africans came to these shores. The layers of history at Catoctin Furnace also include a grassroots historic preservation movement fueled by the threat to the village by roadway construction in the 1960s. You can hear the roadway behind you, but originally that roadway was slated to come right through the center of the village and take out the houses and the historic iron furnace. A group of citizens came together and said, no, we want to preserve this village. It's important, its history is important, and they used the Historic Preservation Act of 1966, which was very new and had been passed by the Lyndon Johnson administration. They used that to protect the village. So that historical society is still in existence and still working very hard to preserve and interpret and share the rich history of Catoctin Furnace with everyone that comes here or sees this video. Erasure and rediscovery. 360 feet south of where we're standing is the African-American Cemetery at Catoctin Furnace. Excavations in advance of the construction of Route 15 in 1979 found 35 graves. The remains were in the path of the roadway, so they were very carefully excavated and they were taken to the Smithsonian, where they remain today. They've been very carefully cared for, and we are learning so much about the lives of the people of Catoctin from those remains. They are revealing their history. Researchers have found 271 first names of people who lived and worked at Catoctin Furnace. In some cases, the reference is simply unknown, but we know that these people were here. And by reading their names, you help remember them. They are not forgotten, and their contribution is remembered. Through our groundbreaking research with Harvard University and our ancient DNA studies, we are hoping to connect people, the descendants of these people. We don't know the last names, but the science of DNA may help us find the descendants so that people can come to Catoctin and say, my ancestors built this, my ancestors made this, my ancestors contributed to America as enslaved or freed African-American workers in the iron industry. So please read the names and help us remember these individuals who made their way through life here at Catoctin Furnace. This is the final stop on the Catoctin Furnace African-American Cemetery Interpretive Trail. And it's a very appropriate place to stop and think about the unquiet nature of this location. You can hear the hum of Route 15, but you can also remember that the cemetery was also not a quiet place. It was beside the open ore pit. It had a path running through it. It was probably located where an eye could be kept on the activities within the cemetery. So in other words, people were watched in life and in death at Catoctin Furnace. When you come here, we want you to think about the people who lived and labored here, and then who were buried here. And we want you to read the poem, Catoctin Cemetery, written by Elaine Bond Hyman. It talks about what it was like to be in the cemetery, to live here, and to be buried here. It's a contemplative space, and we want to remember those people who gave their lives to the industry and prosperity that we, as all Americans, enjoy today. Our tour of Catoctin Furnace Village continues now, and I'm in front of the Museum of the Ironworker. This is one of the original worker houses at Catoctin Furnace, and it was actually built during the winter of 1820-1821, based on very detailed dendrochronology, or tree ring dating. So it's just a few months shy of 200 years old. Soon it will be open with exhibits that are going to tell the story of the workers of Catoctin, all of the workers, the enslaved Africans, the freed African Americans, and the European immigrant workers who came later. We'll talk about family life. It will talk about religion, the ways in which people lived their lives here in Catoctin. Clothing that we found at the forgeman's house will be included, as will artifacts that were found throughout the village. There are many pieces of Catoctin Furnace iron that will also be on display. Beautiful stoves and jam stove plates, pots and kettles, all sorts of iron implements and objects that were made. So please come visit us at the Museum of the Ironworker very soon, and when COVID-19 allows us to reopen. As you can see, the buildings at Catoctin Furnace are very, very small, and so it's a very great challenge to open during times when social distancing is needed. But soon we want to welcome you. So please stay in touch with us, and we hope to see you in person soon. The Collier's Log House was built beginning in 1810, and a second half of it was added 20 years later in 1830. It is the only remaining double log house in the village, so it is unique. In 1973, the Catoctin Furnace Historical Society purchased this building and restored it. It is now a historic house museum that shows what life was like for people living and working in Catoctin Furnace. Multiple families lived in this house together, and even individual boarders would rent like a space there, a bed space to lay their head at night. This house now has a beautiful kitchen garden and a pollinator garden behind it as well, showing what people who lived in the village would raise in their gardens to supplement their diet. Inside the Collier's Log House, you'll notice that there are two fireplaces, two staircases, because more than one family lived in this building during the time of the furnace. Inside, you'll notice as well that there are multiple beds, because the people rented not just part of the dwelling, but they also could rent a space in a bed while the furnace was in blast. So as a historic house museum, the Collier Log House gives you a really good feel for what it was like to live in Catoctin Furnace in the 19th century. Exhibits at the Collier Log House include historic clothing found in the forgeman's house, in the eaves, concealed clothing. It also includes photographs from village families at Catoctin and reconstructions of implements from slavery. We also have a cannonball that's been given to us from Catoctin and some grape shot. So there are many artifacts here in the Collier Log House that tell you about life at Catoctin and also examples of items that were made in the historic Catoctin Furnace. This Benjamin Franklin style stove was made in Catoctin Furnace between about 1811 and 1819 during the ownership of Willoughby Maybury. It was intended to produce more heat and less smoke than an ordinary open fireplace. The stove displays the exquisite craftsmanship for which Catoctin Furnace molders were renowned. There are floral swags topped with bows, flowers and fruits hanging from bows, and even beaded and scalloped edges. It's interesting to note that W. Maybury appears to be misspelled. The stove was clearly prized because it was repaired after a break, and a brass plate was affixed to the interior with the name of the then owner, Harold B. Stabler, on the plaque. It was donated to Catoctin Furnace by the Sandy Spring Museum in 2015, and in 2016 it was conserved by a trip grant from the Tourism Council of Frederick County. This stove type would not have been in a worker home at Catoctin. It would have been in a fancy home in Frederick or Baltimore or even Annapolis, but not in a worker home, as the value of this stove, the cost of this stove, was just way too much for a worker to afford. Upstairs in the Collier Log House, you will see multiple beds, and this is as it would have been in the 19th century when multiple families lived here, and also boarders. There's also a quilting frame, spinning wheel, and other items that are typical of a 19th century dwelling. And when COVID-19 is behind us, we look forward to welcoming you here to the Collier Log House.